hello viewers. Now, regular viewers to my channel will know that I try to pursue an evidence-based approach when it comes to dealing with religion, and that it didn't take me long after leaving the Jehovah's Witness religion for this approach to lead me to atheism. And when it comes to atheism, I honestly believe there are few voices more cogent and compelling in arguing for freedom from religion than today's guest joining me over Skype. It gives me great pleasure to introduce renowned atheist speaker and debater, Matt Dillahunty. Hello, Matt.
Hi, and thanks for having me on.
So first of all, I understand you're from Texas, so can we just confirm that you came through the recent bad weather without too many difficulties?
Yeah, I live in Austin, and so we caught the very northern edge of the storm. It was rained for a few days, and it was a little windy. There was a shingle and one other thing that blew off the roof, but I suffered nothing. I actually sat out in the hot tub during some of the storm, but I did do a few podcasts to, kind of raise awareness and raise some money for the people in Houston and Corpus Christi and stuff who suffered through the storm pretty badly.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to hear that, like you say, you didn't suffer too much, but, unfortunately, the same can't be said of everyone. So we just do what we can, don't we? Now, obviously, you're now an atheist, but you haven't always been. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background in Christian fundamentalism and what led to you ultimately walking away from it.
Yeah, so I think about the shortest version is I was raised primarily Southern Baptist. My mom's family was nominally Catholic, but a lot of them transitioned to Southern Baptist as well. I walked down the aisle at the age of 5 at a revival to accept Jesus into my heart, was active in the church through my entire teen years and mission stuff. And I was convinced, as were I think my parents and most of the people in my youth group, that God wanted me to be a preacher. I was terrified of public speaking. I did not want to be a preacher. And I had a girlfriend, so I left and I joined the Navy instead of doing what I thought God wanted me to do. I spent 8 years in the Navy, then I worked in the tech industry and software. And when I lost my job, I was convinced that this was God punishing me for not becoming a preacher in the first place. And so I spent about 1.5 years in, study and prayer and everything with the goal of doing what God wanted me to do and finally becoming a preacher. And through that process, my roommate at the time was an atheist, and I didn't want to get serious about my religion again and end up, having God say, why aren't you talking to your roommate? I mean, he's like a brother to you. He's going to hell. You're not doing your job. So I specifically looked into the sort of things that might convince a kind of hardened atheist, and it backfired spectacularly. And I ended up realizing that at first I realized I couldn't possibly be a Christian. I knew I found too many problems with the Bible, too many problems with Christian doctrine. And so I kind of set out to figure out what kind of God might exist, because the process of exploring all the religions could take, more lifetimes than I had, which is why I joked for years that I started with Buddhism, find out if I would have, multiple lifetimes. But eventually it became clear that I really needed to study philosophy so I could figure out what type of God might exist in order to better direct the search. And that's kind of how I got from there to here.
Fantastic. I mean, obviously, I'm familiar with your work first through the Atheist Experience show that you did. I watched a documentary with you in it, and I found it absolutely enthralling, what you were doing. And I recently stumbled on a video, which I'll come to later, where you talk about kind of when you were first getting involved in that. In fact, I think there are Atheist Experience episodes with you calling in. Would that be right?
I called in. I was already an atheist by the time I started watching the show. I called in December, I think, of 2013 or 2014, something like that. Basically, just Ashley and Jeff D were on the show, and they were having a conversation, and I had some thoughts about it, and so I called in then.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, they invited me to the after show dinner. I did the dinner I was in the studio the next week, assisting with call screening, and eventually ended up hosting. And I've been doing the host show for 13 years, still doing it. I'll be on this Sunday. So
now, obviously, with that kind of work, you're, very much in the forefront with the atheist movement now, and it could be said that, a lot of things that you have to say will not go down too well with those family members who you left behind in the fundamentalist side of things. Is there much acrimony there with those who knew you when you were a Christian?
There was a lot of problems with my parents, and then we reached an agreement where we just weren't going to talk about this stuff anymore. And my mom has broken that agreement on a couple of occasions, but she's my mom, so yeah, I kind of let it slide. They don't watch the show. They don't come to debates. They don't have any interest in doing any of that. As a matter of fact, one of the debates that I did recently was at a Southern Baptist convention, and I was debating Mike Licona on the resurrection. And one of my best friends from high school, who also went to my church then, his parents and another member of that church, who I hadn't seen in 30 years, flew down from St. Louis, Missouri, just to attend this debate and say hi. And they're all still believers. They just happened to see my name on this, and they called their son and was like, "Is this the same Matt?" And he's like, "Yeah, it is." He godless heathen now. And so I find it funny that Christian people who my parents have a connection with, so much so that after they came down, this other family came down, I gave them my folks' contact information because they all live near each other, and I knew that they'd want to reconnect. And now my folks are interested in going to their church and even moving to the tiny little town they live in to go to their church. And yet my folks would not dare come to a debate that I was doing, and yet this other family did. And it's kind of telling about what they're afraid of. And in the conversations that we've had, my mom has noted that I know the Bible better than she does. I know the history of Christianity. I know the doctrinal stuff better than she does. And I talked about this in a talk I gave recently, because there's nothing that's going to change her mind, and it's all based on her personal experience. She doesn't care. The Bible could be loaded with contradictions and evil things and all this stuff. She just has, trusts God, and she knows that Jesus works in her life, and that's all she needs. And that was very difficult, because I was trying to figure out, I'm not trying to change my folks specifically. I have conversations with the people who want to. I don't go around knocking on doors saying, hey, have you stopped believing in Jesus? And I'm not going to go into my mom's house and every time we meet, be like, "Nice to see you, Mom. You're still wrong about that God thing, and let me explain why." I would never do that. But it's also frustrating dealing with people who not only don't want to have the conversations, but even if they did, it seems that there's nothing you could say that could change their mind.
Yeah, that is sad. Obviously, when I'm listening to you talk about your parents, I'm thinking about my father. My mother's no longer alive, but my dad is a Jehovah's Witness elder, and I would actually give anything just to be able to have any kind of conversation with him on the basis that, like you say, religion is off the agenda. But unfortunately, with the Jehovah's Witness religion, they have shunning, so that you can't have any contact whatsoever. So,
there's that grand irony that he can't get a blood transfusion, and you would be a potentially eligible donor should something go wrong. And so, is the religion preventing you guys from having the conversation? But it would prevent the actual life-saving efforts should something like that happen.
Precisely. Yeah, it's very, very messed up. But all I can say is that I'm kind of jealous in a way that you've at least got some contact with your parents, because I would love that. But it still isn't easy.
It was for a little while. Things never got back to normal, but they got to a new normal. And so I was in St. Louis for a convention. I got there, the night before the convention started. And the first thing I did was I called my dad. And I said, "Okay, I'm here. I figured out what my schedule is. I have the entire evening open if you want to drive over and pick me up." And he's like, "Absolutely. Your mom just threw some hamburgers on. I'll be there in like 30 minutes. We'll come back." And we sat around, we visited, and most of the visit was great. One part of the visit was her telling me all about the YouTube preachers that she likes, and the end times and the spiritual warfare and all that. And I kind of sat there and let it roll off, because my dad was in the room as well. He wasn't, he didn't want this conversation to happen. I didn't want this conversation to happen, not because I'm not interested in it, but because once I start shutting things down with reason, not like closing doors, but pointing out flaws, they'll just get flustered and retreat, and it makes everything uncomfortable. So while I want to change the world, and I'd love for everybody to give up their God beliefs or any belief that it's not supported by evidence, I'd love for that to happen. When it comes to my folks, I just want to hang out with them and share whatever time we have. So I'd rather neither of us ever mention religious stuff again.
Basically, it's not a conversation, is it? It's kind of a one-sided thing where, right, Matt, I'm going to tell you this, and I just want you to listen.
Yeah, it's very, very, very much that. It's not. She will, when it's clear, like I'll let her say a bunch of stuff before she'll say something that forces me to essentially say, no, that's not right. Here's this. And that's when the conversation tends to derail. And so what I've attempted to do most of the time is just change the topic.
Yeah.
Or because I end up spending a lot of time like correcting fellow atheists on bad arguments that they use against religion, or engaging in hyperbole, or having this very close-minded, the Bible says this and this is what it means, as if there's no room for various interpretations. And because I spend a lot of time doing that, when I sit down with my mom, when she brings something up, I can point out how she might have an incorrect interpretation, but not doing it as, I'm the atheist telling you what your Bible means. I get to do it as, hey, you've been a Baptist and a Pentecostal, you were raised around Catholics. You do understand that there's a lot of different interpretations of this. How are you going to go about figuring out which ones are right?
Mm. Which is a reasonable way of approaching it. In fact, there's a lot that I can identify with in the way that you do approach these conversations, which I want to kind of go into in a little bit more detail later. I do just first want to ask you, though, one of the most pressing questions I could think of when I was preparing for this interview. Do you believe that those of us who have experience as fundamentalist believers are uniquely positioned when it comes to arguing for freedom from religion?
What is for something like freedom from religion? We're certainly uniquely positioned, but I don't know that necessarily means that we're the best qualified to talk about it.
Sure.
I know,
sure.
Fourth and fifth generation atheists who can, go into great detail and have spent a lot of time thinking about it, and can speak eloquently about church-state separation.
Mm.
I think where you and I might have the advantage, and I've talked to Dawkins about this as well. If somebody wants to have a debate, like the debate I did with Mike Lacona at a Southern Baptist counter-apologetics convention, as great as Dawkins is, the rock star of atheism in books and blah, 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 he's the wrong person for that. You want somebody like me. You want somebody with a background that can connect with the people in the pews. Because when it comes to 400, 500 Southern Baptists, Richard can't make any connection with them. He was nominally Church of England for a period of time, and he's an elite, extremely Oxford scientist who, even when he tries not to, he's going to speak over their head on some issues. I've often said that if I have any expertise at all, it is in taking difficult concepts and dumbing them down to where almost anybody can understand them. And not that I'm saying that the Southern Baptists there are stupid or anything. I have a credibility with them is almost instantly recognizable, because when I talk about the Bible, I'm talking about it from their perspective, from having lived that for a number of years. And it's very difficult for religious folks to come to a debate that I've done and walk out and go, that guy was, he wasn't a real Christian. He doesn't know anything about all this. I mean, they may say I wasn't a real Christian, but they don't get to dismiss me on the same grounds that they would dismiss Dawkins or somebody else.
Yeah, that was kind of more the angle I was thinking of, because I mean, Dawkins is invaluable, as are many of the other luminaries in the atheist movement, when it comes to putting across fantastic arguments that are almost or are impossible to dismantle. But I think that when you're engaging with people and you're trying to kind of show them information, it does help when there is that common ground and that shared experience. That's basically what I think that you have.
I've said before, what I want to change the world. I want to change minds. I want people to give up religious beliefs. But when I go out and I do these debates, it's not about convincing my opponent. It's not even necessarily about convincing, the specific people who are in attendance, in the pews or in the chairs. But what I want to do is encourage them to think, and I don't want them to ever be able to honestly say they've never met an atheist, and they've never met an atheist who was able to give good reasons for why they don't believe. And so a lot of this is just about simple education and kind of like first contact, sort of. Because what they know about non-believers, it has been almost entirely colored by what they hear from the pew. Oh, these are secularists who want to kill babies and destroy God's country, and they're working for Satan even if they don't know it. And they're not smart, and all the science is on our side. And I just want to kind of confound the biases that they have, because that's the first step. And then from there, myself and other people can take the next step, which is, hey, the neighbor that you like and have liked for years is a non-believer. And that good person who works with you at your charity on the weekend is a non-believer. And the doctor, who performed the operation that you needed is a non-believer. And the person who collects your trash is a non-believer. Getting towards atheist normalcy, where there's awareness of this, fundamentally changes how we view it. It's the same thing we've seen with gay rights and marriage equality and stuff like that, where, shows like Will and Grace probably did as much for moving forward gay rights as anything that's ever happened. And this is about making it very difficult to hate someone who is different from you, because now you've actually met them, or you've met a representative of that group. It changes. Changing minds isn't just about presenting the best facts in the best way. If it was, the scientists would be the greatest debaters, and they're not.
Yeah, that's something I'm kind of finding kind of organically in my own activism, is that when you're entering these conversations, when you get the opportunity to enter into these conversations, there's no need to kind of have a destination or a conclusion in mind. It's, as you say, about presenting a human face to a position that they probably haven't thought of before, and letting them do with that information what they will.
I think if I understand what you're meaning by not having a destination in mind, I think that's a great point, because the destination that I have in mind, if there is one, is I want to have a successful conversation. I want to potentially learn something. I want to potentially teach something. If you go into it with the thought of, I need to fix these people, then you're already assuming that you're right, which you may not be. And that, it's like it can build up messiah complexes and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm far more interested in having a productive conversation than I am with showing everybody how right I am.
And it just doesn't come across well either if you go into it saying, I have some knowledge to dispense here. It's never going to sit well with your intended audience.
Please open your book to page 3 as I tell you everything that I have thought all these years.
Yeah, that's pretty much what they're used to in their religious community. So I think it's nice if they can see a contrast there.
Yeah.
So some of those stumbling on this video will be believers in the Bible as the literal inspired word of God. They will believe that regardless of the flaws with Jehovah's Witnesses, ultimately there must be just one true religion approved by God. And if the Watchtower Society is the best fit, then they need to stick with it or risk annihilation at Armageddon. What would be your message to people in that mindset?
Well, I don't know how you could possibly determine what the best fit is unless you have access. Like if there's 1,000 different religions that are making subtle, even within the ones that call themselves Christian or some version of Christian that rely on the Bible, if they've all reached different conclusions, how do you tell which one of them has got it right? But there's a bigger problem, and that is that what makes you think any of them have managed to get it right? So with all the religions of the world, they are, there are, pick any two or three, they're going to be mutually exclusive in their ideas. They could not possibly all be correct, but it is possible that they're all wrong. If you don't have, this is kind of a Pascal's wager type thing of, oh, there's got to be a God, and I need to pick right now. Well, what if there's not a God? First of all, now you've spent all this time toiling over it, and then you've been intellectually dishonest in latching on to the one that you like or that you can make a case is compelling, irrespective of whether it's true. So that's a problem. You've also put yourself in this position where you've closed the door to possibly finding truth. Because as soon as you say this is the right answer, you stop looking for other potential more right answers. I did a whole 35-minute video on Pascal's wager showing all the flaws in it. But at the end of the day, you should believe something when you actually have good reason to believe it, and not just because you haven't found a reason not to, or because you feel the urge that you must decide something. So I'm going to take this one, because what if there is a God, and he's a bit of a douche, and he's decided that the best test is to find out who is going to actually engage their brain and be willing to only accept things for good reasons. Maybe the entire existence here is a big gullibility test, and everyone who latched on to whatever was the religion of their parents, or the one that was most familiar, or based on their initial kind of understanding seemed to be right, those people all failed because they didn't bother to look into it seriously enough and reserve judgment until it was warranted.
That's right. Yeah, I'm thinking as well of, because I'm trying to kind of use the fact that you're here to pitch questions to you that might come into the minds of JWs who stumble on this channel, perhaps. And one, maybe you're familiar with the scripture. I think it's in John, where Jesus' disciples turn to him after there's been some controversy, and they say, "Lord, who else will we go away to? You have sayings of everlasting life." And that's quite often used by JWs to say, well, there is nowhere else to go. This is the best fit. It works well for me, so I'm going to stay there. There's kind of like a complacency, I think, with a lot of JWs, certainly.
If you take what happens there in John 6 in context, I think there's a fairly plain reading. What's actually happened here is Jesus has lost some of his disciples, not the apostles, but people who'd been around. They got tired of him and walked off. And Jesus is like, hey, you guys going to leave too? And they're basically saying, no, we don't want to leave you because you're the one that's got the words of eternal life.
Yeah.
It is kind of like the Doubting Thomas thing, where it's a story that's put there to discourage people from leaving. Yeah, you may want to leave. You may find this is all hooey, but the real apostles stayed here because I was the one talking about eternal life. But for me, there's another interesting aspect of this story. That means that Jesus was walking around supposedly performing miracles and saying wonderful things. And yet some folks are like, we're done with that guy. We'll go do something else. It reminds me of something that I'd said about the Exodus story. And I had come up with a modern example. You're in a foreign country. You don't speak the language. You're with someone who's pregnant. They go into labor. You're desperately asking people for help. You're getting no response. Nobody understands you. You hit your knees and pray, and a big ball of light shows up, and you feel compelled to follow it. You follow it. It leads you to a car that is running with the keys in it. You jump in the car. You're heading off. The ball of light is leading you down the highway. All the cars are getting out of the way. You get directly to the hospital. Is there anything for the rest of your life that could ever convince you that you hadn't just experienced a direct answered prayer and instruction from God, Is there anything that would ever make you go, I'm done with that God? That's just silly. Let me go make a new God of my own. Not even if she gets there and she dies and or the baby dies. It doesn't change what happened to lead you up to that.
Mm.
And Exodus would tell us that the ancient Israelites experienced these, parted seas and manna from heaven and pillars of cloud by day and pillars of fire by night. And they're led up there. And then Moses goes away for like 40 days. And they're like, screw that God that just saved us. Let's make a golden calf and worship, strange gods. It doesn't make sense. It is a complete BS story. And this passage in John echoes back to that for me, that it's more important that I give someone the impression that it would be a bad idea to not listen to me than actually give them a good reason to continue listening to me.
Mm. Yeah, true. I want to talk about, I know I don't want to get too bogged down in verses because, like you say, it's just not worth worrying about anymore. But I do want to ask you a little bit about the Bible itself. Some time ago, I watched your video review of the documentary Patterns of Evidence Exodus. Full disclosure, I haven't watched that yet. And in it, you gave some examples of how the movie essentially tries to force ancient history to align with the Bible narrative. Mm-hmm. Obviously, creationists have made many attempts down through the decades to square this circle. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the Bible and explain what, if anything, about the Bible we can take on face value.
Well, I wouldn't take anything from any source on face value. There are very few things that are like I would consider properly basic or clearly true. There's probably a few. Mm. For me, when the Bible talks about mundane things, I have no problem at all accepting that. And my confidence level is proportional to the evidence for it. So like if you come up to me and you tell me, hey, my name's Lloyd. Okay, cool. I'm going to believe you. In part because it doesn't matter what your name is. You've told me what you want to call you. But if you say, hey, I just got a new car yesterday. Well, that is a completely ordinary claim. I know people... I've bought a new car. I know people buy new cars. I know cars exist. There's nothing about that is fundamentally changing to my understanding of the world or truth. But if you say, I was abducted by a spaceship yesterday and traveled to Mars, I'm not going to believe that. This gets back to this extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the other portion of this is something from Hume, where the wise man proportions his belief or his confidence level to the evidence. And so when the Bible says that there's a supernatural realm and there's a God who's timeless and super powerful, that stuff isn't supported by evidence. It is completely outside the scope. When the Bible says, hey, this person traveled across this land, well, okay, I'm willing to accept that part of it. But if in the process of traveling across that land, they encountered giants and talking donkeys and, apparently with Daniel, something that's been interpreted as space aliens and more, those portions of the story need more evidence. Mm. And this comes into play, I think, quite often when we're talking with mythicists about whether or not Jesus was a real historical figure. I have no problem at all with the idea that there was likely a person at the center of the story. But for me, if I go through the Bible and I list everything that is said about Jesus, we'll set aside whether or not we have an accurate recording of what he said or did, but just the claims about him. There's nothing there that's verifiable, including the name. There's no independent corroboration from outside. Does that mean I think everything about it is an invented fiction? Not necessarily, because I think that claim requires supporting arguments too. David Fitzgerald and I are planning on doing a good sit down to talk about mythicism, because we're friends and we are each convinced that we can convince the other. I think I can convince David that he's perhaps going too far in his claims, and he can convince me that he's absolutely not. And I'm looking forward to that conversation as much or more than any debate that I've had. So when it comes to the Bible, I think what ends up happening is, first of all, most people don't read it. It's just a fact. I have relatives who flat out tell me, I've never read the Old Testament. I don't care that much about the Old Testament. I only know about Jesus. Most of them are getting the information from their pastor. And when they do read it, they tend to either do one of two things. It's, I'm going to read the whole Bible in a year. So it's just boom, 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 go through there. And as soon as they get, past they focus on the stories that they know. And they're mainly, for the rest of it, looking at the words, but not spending a great deal of time thinking about what the words mean. And the other way of reading it is they take the McNuggets. Here's your Bible study for today. Here's this tiny little passage from John 6. What does this mean? And they're told what it means by whatever denomination they're a part of. And then they take that and use that as a lens with which to view everything else. So when I bring up, when we were at the Ark Park in hymns, not non.
Oh, you went to the Ark Encounter, did you?
Yeah, Seth
Wow.
and I just talked about the other day. We went there for the Kentucky Free Thought Convention. And one of the things I pointed out is they had a plaque up there talking about how some Christians had misused the Bible to support slavery based on skin color. And it's completely, the thing is completely dishonest. They know they cannot show that the Bible is opposed to slavery because it's not. It absolutely endorses it. All they can do is say that some people misused it to support slavery based on skin color, which isn't what slavery was based on anyway. I mean, skin color was a part of it, but it's basically these are foreigners. And when the Bible tells you can buy the slaves from the heathen that surround you, that's what it was supporting. But at no point does it say, hey, don't have slaves, which makes it an awful book.
It's interesting that they should add that part in about skin color. Slavery's wrong, regardless of what denominator you choose to decide.
Except that Ken Ham, as a biblical literalist, cannot say slavery is wrong because the Bible specifically permits slavery. So all he can say is they got it wrong, that it should have been, we shouldn't have been enslaving Africans, or we shouldn't have been enslaving people, with darker skin, or these other things. It's a very kind of Machiavellian manipulation of we're really, really wrong here, but we need to make it look like we're not quite so wrong. And so we'll say, oh, these people who supported slavery based on skin color, because they know that most people who read that placard are not going to analyze it the way I did.
Yeah.
What they're going to see is, Christians have misused the Bible to support slavery. That's their takeaway from it, because we are incredibly lazy. Nobody spends a great deal of time analyzing this stuff. And when you're surrounded by people who believe, and they believe pretty much the same things you do, your interest in critically examining the text vanishes, because you begin with the assumption that there is a God. This is God's message to me. There's something important for me to discover here. I must go discover this. And if that is the process by which you begin reading the book, guess what? You are going to discover important things, because in a book that can be read in many different ways, that is about life from different perspectives, of course you're going to find things that are important and significant to you. I can open the book. I can pretty much open a Bible. If I had one here on my desk, it's in the other room, at random. And I can, as a former believer, find a passage that is beautiful and tells me something wonderful because I'm interpreting that way. And probably within a page, either way, as an atheist, I can find something that is repugnant and immoral and irrational. And so if you're just going to go through and cherry pick the things that you like, that's how you get that constant support for religion. If you're not going to examine it honestly and in detail and be willing to, follow the evidence where it leads, and if it turns out that the Bible is an immoral book or contains passages that support things that you're opposed to, if you're not willing to change your mind and give this up, then you're engaged in this kind of self-reinforcing delusion that I don't know how you get out of until you start to care about whether or not something's true and good.
It's interesting that I think a lot of religions use this cherry picking. It's kind of an intrinsic part of their propaganda, because essentially what the Ark Encounter is one huge propaganda piece, really, and the information displays and the plastic dinosaurs and what have you. It's reminding me of something that we have in Jehovah's Witnesses called JW Broadcasting, where every month they will put out an hour-long piece, and it's all set up in like a newsroom and everything, and they'll introduce different segments. And like you say, it's just presenting information, boom, 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 with the conclusions all kind of nicely presented for the audience, with no kind of stimulus whatsoever to kind of drill deeper and find out what the real meaning is. It's interesting that it's used in all these this technique is used so frequently in religion.
I tell you, one of the most common passages, I mean, the passage that even non-Christians know, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Ta-da. This is drilled into people's heads. And of course, as somebody who walked down the aisle at 5 and was pretty much in church all of his life, my view of this was, God loves you and wants to save you. God made the ultimate sacrifice and desperately wants to save you. And all you have to do is be willing to turn your life over, accept that this happened, repent of your sin, blah, blah, blah. The problem here is that I ran into people who, even with this particular phrasing, what they walked away with was a different idea. And that is, I've either done something or will do something that is so horrible that Almighty God had to kill himself to make up for it. Now, both of those are ways of looking at this. They're both accurate. We talked about the idea of original sin and substitutional atonement and all these other things. That passage, it's not dishonest of the individuals to think about it in either good terms or bad terms. It's only dishonest if you deny the other. And so you have to look at that passage and say, okay, yes, it's true. I am a filthy sinner who has done or will do something that caused God to come down and take human form and kill himself to serve as a loophole for rules that he created. Until you actually do the full honest appraisal of it, I don't know that you can get to the other obvious conclusion, which is, isn't God ultimately responsible for all this? Did God make this universe knowing that I would become an atheist and be damned to hell? And if so, did he have an option? Could he have made a different universe where I remained a Christian or whatever? If he had an option, then he made the decision which makes him ultimately responsible. And what happens quite often is they'll say, well, God can't reveal himself or you'd have no choice but to believe. Okay, well, that's nonsense, because even within your story, Satan absolutely knows that God exists and chose to rebel. So I would, why wouldn't I have that same choice as well? You just can't understand this stuff. Okay, so now you've got a model where God has created beings that can't understand what he wants them to understand. Isn't that still his fault? If I create a Sims game and I try to give instructions to the characters and they don't understand me, is that their fault? Didn't I create them? Why didn't I create them with the ability to, at a minimum, grasp the things that are important? There's this parade of nonsense that is all. It's not just how you look at it. It's, can you step back from it and look at, does this make sense in a broader context? Yeah,
there's a justification for everything. And I think, like you say, only once you give yourself permission to step back and think, well, hang on, either God's real or he isn't real. And if he's real and he's someone that I respect, then he's going to respect me honestly looking at these beliefs. And for example, with the issue of human suffering, we have a situation where millennia of humans have suffered to an insane degree and continue to suffer, and all of this is apparently part of God's plan. How is that an elegant plan for there to be thousands and thousands of years of human suffering? How do you kind of concoct a plan where that is a reasonable element of the plan for there to be that much suffering on that at that much scale?
Yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about in the near future in a video about the problem of evil, or the problem of unnecessary suffering.
Good.
Because I don't find it a particularly compelling counter argument to God as it's normally presented.
Right.
because, I would have had, when I put my Christian hat back on, I have a very easy response. Oh, well, no. God allowed us freedom, and we brought sin and death into the world, and we are the cause of that suffering. God could have created a perfect utopia, but he wanted to give us the freedom to reject that, and blah, 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 blah. So there's there's a way to spin this for everything. But I think once you hear that response, I think there's an even better challenge that goes beyond just, suffering. There's mountains of absurdity in the God models. And I don't just mean with regard to, the various versions of Christianity. A lot of this stuff applies to Islam, Hinduism. There's nothing about the world that makes sense under any God model that I've been presented with, apart from the one where there isn't a God.
Well, I definitely look forward to that video. Actually, I wanted to speak a little bit about philosophy. When you first came to my attention on the atheist experience, one thing that really impressed me was your ability to reason with people, not only with logic, but also on philosophical grounds. How did you come to, you mentioned a little bit before about learning philosophy. What was that process like for you? And do you feel it's important to have a grasp of philosophy when engaging with fundamentalists?
Well, it's absolutely important. So first of all, I'm not remotely an expert. I have no formal credentials. I've been called a dilettante. It's probably accurate. I'm just a fan of the subjects, and I spend a great deal of time reading and studying. I can't tell you everything about every different philosopher and schools of philosophy. As a matter of fact, I've said before that once I got done reading Hume with regard to epistemology and proper application of skepticism, I felt like I was kind of done. Like Hume pretty much sorted this stuff out. Not necessarily in great detail on every little thing, but the goal was to broaden my understanding of how to go about thinking. And as someone who was already a skeptic, it was basically about finding the foundation behind my skepticism. It's one of those things like, I know it's a good thing to be skeptical, and I can kind of tell you what that means, but I don't necessarily know why. And what it fundamentally changed for me was the question that I often ask is, tell me what you believe and why. And the why part is the more important of the two. And there's another question that often doesn't get asked, which is, you've told me what you believe. You've told me why you believe it. Now, the next question is, why should I believe it? Because there may be this scenario where you are convinced that you have a good justification. My wife is at work right now. I believe that to be the case, and I have good reason. You don't necessarily have good reason to believe that. So what is it about, if I'm trying to convince you that my wife is at work, it may be the case that I have to not only provide you my reasons for thinking this, but I may have to go further and add additional evidence in order for you to be justified, because you don't have the same experiences with this that I do. I complained once that I've spent the bulk of my adult life in what I called a negative headspace, not with respect to religion, but with respect to my job in software QA was to find out everything that was broken and find ways to break it. My job on the Atheist Experience TV show was to evaluate in great detail any argument that was presented to find out, is there a fallacy here? Is there something unsound about one of the premises? And to have the base understanding of those things to be able to do it. And I thought it was a real negative. And I had this mild epiphany one day that it's not a negative. Not only with regard to the results are positive. This is how you come about believing more true things and fewer false things. But in order to engage in that, in order to try to find out what's broken, you have to have a good understanding of what it should look like if it were working properly. And inside of software, you've got your design documents and stuff like that, and you're basically comparing it to a standard. And so when it comes to claims about the world or claims about the supernatural or gods, you have to have some understanding of what the world would look like were that to be true. What sort of evidence would you expect? And this is why Vic Stinger, who's no longer around, a great physicist, and I was very happy that we got to be friends for a brief time before he died. I had always had a problem with this assertion that even atheists make nonstop, which is absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It just feels right. The fact that I can't show you evidence for this doesn't mean it's not true. That's correct. But Vic Stenger pointed out the thing that I'd kind of been trying to find a better way to express, which is absence of evidence is evidence for absence when we would expect there to be evidence. It's not absolute confirmation. So if you say there's a dead body in my trunk, and we go out and we open your trunk and we don't find a dead body, we don't even find any evidence that there was a body in there at all, that is, we don't have evidence for your proposition. But we do have evidence that your proposition is actually wrong. If you tell me you have a cat and I come over to your house and I find no cat hair, no cat bowls, cat puke, cat food, cat litter boxes, there's nothing there that would indicate that
you've discovered something, basically. You've made a discovery.
I have no evidence to show you're wrong, or no evidence to support your position. But the absence of evidence where evidence would be expected is enough to at least tentatively say you're wrong. We're not going to get to absolute certainty. I've not disproved the notion that you have a cat, because maybe we mean something different by cat, or maybe you keep it somewhere other than your house. But if we were to outline what you mean by that, not finding evidence to support it when we would expect there to be evidence is evidence against it. It's not absolute confirmation that you're wrong, but it is evidence against the proposition. And I think that's important. There's a lot of those quippy sayings that we love to grasp onto that are right in kind of a general sense, but they need a step or two further. And this is what I learned as I was, I still go through, I still study philosophy stuff. I love thought experiments and stuff like that, the issues with identity and the transporter problem, the ship of Theseus, and all these things, because thinking about them, even if you don't come to an answer, the process of thinking about them is helpful. Because if you don't solve this, you are still gaining information about how you might solve it. And at a minimum, you are finding out ways you can't solve it. So it applies. It's the same thing that you do in mathematics or something else, when you've got this theorem that's been out there for ages and nobody's been able to demonstrate it. Every now and then we find, hey, somebody's finally found a way to prove Fermat's last theorem and other stuff. And the reason they were able to do that is in part because a lot of other people had tried and showed what methods don't work. And that leads you toward the methods that might work. It's
basically like a process of elimination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you might just need somebody who's way smarter than everybody else who kind of intuits the solution. There's many different paths, but at the end of the day, we should believe things when the evidence warrants belief. And that means that we shouldn't be able to find fallacies. We shouldn't be reliant on biases and personal experiences and appeals to things beyond our, the universe. It is all about, for me, I'm a skeptic, I'm a humanist, and I'm an atheist. And I'm an atheist because I'm a skeptic. I'm a humanist because I'm an atheist and a skeptic. But even if I found out there was a God, I would stop being an atheist. I'd still be a skeptic and I'd still be a humanist. And if it turned out that God had values that were inconsistent with humanism, I wouldn't worship. Well, I wouldn't worship anyway, but I wouldn't revere, and I wouldn't say, oh, well, he's right and everything about humanism is wrong. It's about the evidence and what leads to a better world.
Indeed. Just on the subject of philosophy, one thing that amazes me, because you said that you're not an expert on it, I'm even less of an expert on it. But I do, try and immerse myself from time to time in those sorts of videos and those sorts of debates. And one thing that I find astonishing is that for every sort of atheist philosopher or every atheist who's willing to debate along philosophical lines, there's one or two theist philosophers as well. So kind of what's your take on that? And are there any religious apologists who you struggle with or you would shy away from when it comes to debating philosophy?
Well, depending on what we mean by debating philosophy, there's plenty of philosophical debates that I'm not remotely qualified to have and not all that interested in.
Right. So there is like a threshold to what parts of philosophy interest you, basically, when it comes to debating religion.
Certainly some parts interest me more than others, but there are parts that interest me that I'm not remotely qualified to debate, and others that interest me where I might be okay at having a debate. I'm certainly open to discussions with anybody about anything almost. When it comes to something like consciousness and free will, my understanding is pretty much in line with Dan Dennett's, but I don't have the knowledge and expertise in the area that Dan has. And so if somebody wanted to debate that, I mean, I would perhaps do a debate on free will. I don't find it to be all that a valuable use of my time, in part because we either have free will or we don't, and it's all dependent on definitions, and the debate doesn't seem to get us. I'm not convinced that we get me anywhere. When it comes to philosophers who are also believers, it depends. There are some who are theologians in the sense of I'm a sophisticated theologian, and I think they are engaged in an exercise that is both bizarre and unproductive. God either exists or he doesn't. The God that I believed in, the God that most people believe in, was as obvious as the trees, which is why people will call into the show and say, hey, just look at the trees. You can't make a tree. You can't explain that. The tide goes in, the tide goes out. That's how most people think. If in fact, like, let's take somebody like Alvin Plantinga, who's a theologian, probably, I think, mathematician, philosopher, but he has probably most famous for his monologic version of the ontological argument. And I know that everybody listening to your show just fell asleep as soon as I rattled that off. And I'm not going to go through the argument. What I do want to point out is that St. Anselm, hundreds of years ago, came up with the ontological argument. Essentially, from my view, it defines God into existence by saying that something that exists is more perfect than something that doesn't exist fundamentally. And therefore, it's more, if there is a perfect being and there must necessarily be a perfect being, then God exists.
Yeah.
And that there are people right now who are hitting themselves in the head. I have done videos on this. I'm trying to keep it simple here. The argument's never been persuasive, even when people couldn't really show what was wrong with it. And so Plantinga comes along and he comes up with a modalogic version of this, where it's about possible worlds and necessary worlds and blah, 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 blah. Let's assume that his argument is both valid and sound. Then what has happened here is Plantinga, a Christian theist, has come up with an argument that demonstrates that God must necessarily exist. And yet virtually no one on the planet can even understand the argument. I mean, this is like a fraction of a percent of people who have the requisite knowledge to process that argument and go, yes, that argument is valid and sound, and now my belief is justified. And so you've got a scenario where there's a God who creates everything and puts you down on a planet and gives you a brain with which to figure out the world and gives you all the tools, except that he makes these brains unequal. He gives some of them physical conditions that prevent them from grasping complex topics. I'm not a big fan of IQ evaluations for anything, but it's undeniable. There are some people who comprehend things at a level better than others. If only the tiniest portion of people can be properly justified in accepting this argument, what does that say about that God? Is all this just for the really, really smart folks? Is the world now biased against people of average intelligence, of slightly less than genius level intelligence? Is it biased against the people,
I'm glad you've said that, because I always thought it was a little bit of a cop-out to say that argument just sounds so convoluted, it just doesn't sound like it's worth wasting too much time on. But you've just given me a reason why I can't say that, so thank you.
Well, I think one of the things we know is that incredibly smart people are really good at rationalizing things that they've come to believe for not very smart reasons. Michael Shermer said something like that at one point, and I liked it. But so you've got two situations, or a couple different situations here. Either God really only wants the super smart people, in which case, why the hell are the rest of us here? Or worse, there is a sound argument for the existence of God, and yet, if the people who understand it can now explain it to others, they might have a hope of being justified. But if that's the case, then what's happening is God is revealing himself in an indisputable fashion to the smartest people, but he's not revealing himself at all to the other people, or at least not through this particular argument. We know that if you're really smart, you are probably pretty good at being able to fool yourself with certain things. So isn't it more likely that the people who are convinced by the modal logic version of the ontological argument are actually engaged in a bit of really smart self-deception? At the end of the day, though, even that version of the argument, I not only do I not find it compelling, I think that we've come as close as we can to demonstrating this not sound. And there's other, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. All of these are in a category where God has set up a world where there's a bulletproof argument for his existence, but almost nobody can understand it. And that's just, you're a douche if you did.
Yeah.
I mean, why not just run around and kick little kids on the playground and say, ah, ha, ha, you don't understand this. And oh, by the way, we're coming up with these arguments in the 20th century. And if this is the one true argument that confirms God, not only did people not have a justification for believing for the last couple thousand years, but they didn't have any, God didn't seem to give a crap about anybody and prior to Jesus coming. All those people.
He had to wait for philosophy to become sufficiently sophisticated in order for all of this to be explained over those 2,000 years, apparently.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a curious thing that when I talk about slavery, for example, people are like, "Oh, well, God spoke to those people in terms that they understand. His plan was to get rid of slavery entirely, but he knew that they weren't ready for that, and they would have to work up to that." I'm like, hang on a minute. What kind of weak-ass God do you believe in? Because he can tell you, don't eat shellfish and don't wear clothing of mixed fabrics and don't kill people and don't covet. But he can't say don't own people as property. He needs you to sort that one out on your own. Well, why couldn't he sort out the shellfish thing on your own and stop owning people?
Well, we could go off on a tangent at some of the crazy stuff that's in the Bible, like you say, shellfish and standards on dress and grooming, but the really big stuff like don't rape kids somehow didn't make the final edit. Astonishing.
Yeah, it was fun for me. Aaron Ross, a friend of mine, he actually performed my wedding, and he was talking in Oklahoma about the Bible, and he got a couple things just wrong, where he was talking about, the Bible doesn't say anything against incest, and they tried to use the story of Lot and his daughters to suggest supports incest. But I told him afterwards, I was like, you had a much better opportunity, because in Deuteronomy it basically lists who you can and can't have sex with. Like you can't have your dad's wife or your dad's wives, plural, and it goes through and it makes all these lists. But there are some glaring omissions, like father-daughter sex is not prohibited. I don't know why, and so the standard Christian response that I've heard is, "Oh, well, that one's just obvious."
Yeah, I've heard that one as well. Yeah.
The other ones weren't obvious. How is it obvious that you shouldn't have sex with your daughter, but it's not obvious that you shouldn't have sex with your mom?
And they can't really use that when it's already included in the Bible. Thou shalt not murder. Surely that's an obvious one too.
Yeah.
Astonishing. Now, we must press on because I don't want to encroach on your time too much. I did want to talk about this video that you uploaded recently because I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It's called Dealing with Unchangeable Minds. And to my viewers, I would highly recommend that anyone who wants to involve themselves in reaching out to people with fundamentalist indoctrination, please check it out. I'm going to play a brief clip now.
We need out rational, humanist atheists changing the world around the minds that won't be changed. There are plenty of people who will change their mind. There's plenty of people who do it from listening to the show. There are people who will do it from listening to debates. There were people who will do it on their own because they found something frustrating. They didn't get the right answer from their pastor. They will find a way and they will change their mind. And there are people who don't, it doesn't seem like they will change their mind, but that's because you're not the one to help them with it. The first time you hear an idea, it's just weird. The second time you hear it, it's, hey, I've heard that before. And the third time you hear it, it's, wait a minute, there's a pattern here. Going back to the 3 on a match is bad luck thing from wartime. It's good luck. It's the way we recognize patterns. 1, 2, 3, pattern. 1, wow. 2, 3, But there are people whose minds aren't going to be changed. They're going to go to their grave. There are people that unfortunately we have to wait for them to die off. And in the meantime, you change the world around them to make their bad ideas less impactful. Now, I can rant with the best of them, but I'm far more careful to ensure that my rants do not include hyperbole and overreaching, because it becomes an obvious weakness that allows the opposition to ignore the good content whenever you're right. And if you're right, you don't need it. I think it's possible and wise to make our case strong, compassionate, and my new favorite word, unimpeachable. We have the higher ground, and we should act like it. And acting like it can also include ridicule of ideas, not people, usually. And you can have heated, passionate discussions that are wholly, with a W, honest and accurate.
So I love the point you make about recognizing patterns and about how sometimes people need to hear an argument several times by different people before it will sink in. It reminded me of how you sometimes hear atheists say that the same arguments have been made again and again and we don't need to hear them anymore. They seem to think that we can just move on to other stuff, and once it's been said for all time. I've always had the opinion, and I don't know whether this is something you would agree with, that the more people you have explaining something, the better, because you have no way of knowing whose voice will end up being the one that resonates.
Yeah, and it's going to be different for different people. I mean, I've been asked before, I've done the TV show for 13 years, it's unlikely that I'm going to hear anything new or anything truly new. There may be some slightly different versions of things, and while I make a game out of the show, I try to find new ways to say things that I've said, 100 times before, because it may resonate a little bit differently in somebody else. But I also try to remember that just because I've said something 100 times doesn't mean that the person I'm talking to or the person who's hearing me this time has heard it 100 times. I mean, anybody who's watched everything that I've ever said is either an atheist or probably falls into the unchangeable mind category. So, when I walk in and do the show, my kind of game I play is, okay, this is somebody's first episode. It is somebody's only episode. It is not my job to, be perfect and come up with everything that is going to convince everybody all at once. It's to get information out because, like I was saying, I think it was in that clip or somewhere else in that talk, that the first time you hear something, it's just that doesn't conform to your worldview. It's strange, whatever. And the second time, it's like, hey, I've heard that before. And the third time, you've got a pattern. And I could say something to people, and then you could say something to people, and then somebody else could say something to those same people, and that third time might be when they change their mind, or maybe it's the 10th time, or maybe it's the 50th time, or maybe after they've made the rounds through several people, they come back and listen to me again. And so when people come up to me at conventions and they're like, "Oh my gosh, it's so great to meet you. You've changed my life. You freed me from religion," I always tell them the same thing. I didn't. I appreciate the fact that you're appreciating the work that I did, But there's 1,000 other people who heard me say the same thing and they didn't change their mind. You need to take ownership of the fact that you changed your mind. You were willing to consider the evidence. I used to, kind of self-deprecating.
Don't self-defecate. That it's not about that.
I used to become more self-deprecating and just say, hey, I'm just some guy that talks. Well, you can't do a TV show for 13 years and help a lot of people find their way towards rationality and still say that. I recognize that I am at least good at what I do and that people have benefited. I'm far from being the only one. I'm not even the only one on our show. I'm not even my favorite person on our show. A spoiler alert for anybody who's going to go watch that video. There's two different versions of that talk. There's only one that's available on YouTube to watch.
Oh, right. Okay.
The other version talked a lot about my mom. And
right.
because she fits into that category, and I didn't want to go into it in detail on a video for everybody. But this issue, the spoiler alert thing is that I don't know what the answer is to changing people's minds who seem to be intractable.
Yeah.
But I do know that minds do change, and I do know that if we change the world around them, we can minimize the impact that their bad ideas have. My preferred solution to bad ideas is to present better ideas and to expose what's wrong with the bad ideas. Because while there may be a bunch of people who are never going to change their mind about whether or not there's a God, or about whether or not white people are superior, or about, pick your, really horrible idea, there are people whose minds will be changed. And if we create a world where the bad ideas, I used to use flat earthers as an example and say, almost nobody believes that stuff anymore. And now, of
you
course,
can't say that anymore, can you? Yeah.
It's incredibly popular. I used to joke that, hey, nobody believes in Zeus anymore. And then I started getting emails from people who are like, I do. How dare you say something? And I'm like, okay, I apologize. Not for not taking you seriously, but for not realizing that there was somebody out there who thought I should take that seriously.
No, I mean, listen, the video, I don't want to rave on about it too much, but it was helpful for me as somebody who is kind of involved or involving himself in trying to reach through to people who are in, fundamentalist cult. I recently went on my own little tour of America. We did East Coast, West Coast, and then we ended up in Vancouver. And one of the questions that I got asked most frequently and continue to get asked most frequently is, how do I wake up my loved ones? How do I wake up my husband? How do I wake up my wife?
Yeah.
And I think from now on, well, first of all, I say the same thing as you say, which is there's no silver bullet. But I think just some of the very basic points that you made, and we were talking before about how, sometimes, sometimes things may seem obvious, but they're worth repeating. And a lot of what you said in that video was obvious, but it did need repeating.
I think there's a problem too in this. How do I change my spouse? Okay, you might be going into it with the wrong motivation. It would seem to me my preferred take on it is not how do I change them? It's how do I make them understand why we disagree? Because that's going to be the first step to either changing them or changing you.
Yeah.
Is to a point where they actually understand. And by the way, atheists haven't cornered the market on reason or skepticism or rationality. I have plenty of people who are posting criticism of me for any number of things, and they'll say, oh, Matt's great on religion, or Matt's great on this, but he's awful on this subject. And whatever, I use the phrase this subject because they all come up with different things that I'm wrong about. I would love to put all of them in the room and let them argue with each other about how I'm right about all the things, because everything would be covered then. If I've said 10 things, somebody disagrees with or agrees with 9 and disagrees with 1. And so get the people in the room to sort that out. But the goal of changing people implies that you're right.
Yeah.
And everybody thinks they're right. This is something I covered in that talk. You know, what's it feel like to be wrong? Well, it feels exactly like being right. You're just unaware. I don't know of too many people who say, I'm absolutely wrong about this, but I'm convinced of it anyway. That almost never happens. I have had somebody in the atheist community tell me that my position on an issue was morally superior, and yet they were still going to continue doing the immoral thing. I've had people tell me that, because that seems to be a different pathway than just whether or not you're factually correct or whether or not you have good reason. It's a little bit more emotive.
No, I get what you're saying, and I agree with it. In fact, I had a similar conversation with one of my previous guests who was on, and we were talking about how, setting out to change people's minds has like an arrogance to it. I think my own take with Jehovah's Witnesses in particular is that's true, although there is also a danger to being a Jehovah's Witness. For example, what if they needed a blood transfusion? It's clearly not advantageous for them to be a Jehovah's Witness in that situation.
Yeah, I'm not in any way suggesting that we just, it's okay. One of my most hated phrases when somebody says, well, let's just agree to disagree. No, I will agree that we do in fact disagree, but what you're suggesting with agree to disagree is that there's no pathway to truth here. If I'm happy to point out that your position is irrational, that it is harmful, that it is dangerous. But what I'm talking about is it's not a bad thing to want to change someone's mind. It is a problem when you're saying, how do I change my spouse's mind to agree with me? Well, okay, if even if that's your goal, you want the real answer, make the best arguments and begin with getting an understanding. Because when I challenge people who will disagree with me, and I'll say, number one, what is my position? And number two, why do you think it's wrong? And almost without fail, nobody even gets the first part right. Instead, they have a misunderstanding of my position, or they'll label me with somebody else's position or attach somebody else's position to me. And so we have to have those conversations. And this involves, as I pointed out in this talk, charitable listening, which also involves mirroring. So when somebody says something to you, you should say, okay, what I'm understanding you saying is this. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Until you get a yes from them, you should not engage, because you are, by definition, engaging in a straw man.
You need to know what their position is before you start,
Now, what happens sometimes in this mirroring thing is you will tell me, for example, that you're absolutely confident that the Bible is 100% the literal perfect word of God. And when I say, so what I'm hearing you saying is there are no errors in the Bible. Then, because I've kind of phrased that in a way that is not exactly what you said, but points down the direction that I'm going, you'll come back with, no, that's not what I said. And then you'll clarify. This is also fine. This is a process of conversation that whittles down. And it is part of the version of the Socratic method, which I think is the best tool we have to encourage people to change their own minds, which is to keep asking questions. But the thing about asking questions is you don't just have to say, it doesn't just have to be a question, like a flat question. It can be, what I hear you saying is this, or doesn't that imply this, which is a question. But people think that it's just kind of this arms crossed, sit back, and let me ask you this, and let me ask you this. It's about having a conversation that's leading towards understanding for both of you, because the truth will win out if you're actually both honestly pursuing it.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm really glad that you went into that list, because that was one of the next things I wanted to ask you about, but it just kind of segued perfectly into that, and I don't need to go over it again. But again, viewers watching this, if you check out Matt's video, he gives, I think it's 6 tips on basically having that kind of conversation, and a lot of it is just basic stuff, like you say, listening properly and trying to make sure you've established what their position is before you start, approaching it. Such obvious stuff, but so missing and so absent in dialogue today, I think.
You see it happening on on the Atheist Experience show, and you see it in its most frustrating format, I think. So much that it may even be unrecognizable to people, because somebody will say something and I will respond, or somebody on the show will respond with, okay, well, what about this? Or doesn't that imply this? Or, please hang on, before we go any further, you need to define what you mean by this. Getting the definitions down is critical. But because it's in this back and forth conversation where they know they're on TV, they know they're up against, an opponent who's known for arguing people into a corner to expose their flaws, they're on heightened defense. And so what seems to almost be talking past each other, which occasionally it is talking past each other, but in some cases it is just a Socratic method. But what you're seeing from the person on the phone is, oh my gosh, I'm getting ready to get trapped. So the defenses go up, and I'll say, no, that's not what I meant. I meant this. And what you'll end up, I think you could pick out some phone calls where somebody literally talks about 4 different topics while trying to clarify the first one. And I think what's happening in their brain is, part of their brain is thinking about, how do I revive and recover this first point?
They're stalling for time, do you think?
Let me make these other points while I'm sorting it out. And maybe I can BS my way full circle to saying, and that's why my first point is this. It's fun. And it's people are like, oh, how can you do the show? You've done the show for so many years. I love thinking. I love making people think. I love watching people think. I like puzzles, and I've been a magician since I was 3 and performing. I love, fooling people. But it doesn't bother me anymore if I do a magic trick and somebody figures out how it was done. Only thing that bothers me is if I've done something and they weren't entertained. And so the show isn't entertainment. It's kind of the opposite of that. And it frustrates me sometimes that the only things people know about the show are some atheist went through and pulled out, a rant and the 10 times that Matt Dillahunty completely destroyed a Christian. And that becomes a sum total.
Is it awkward seeing those videos pop up, by the way, in your YouTube feed? You don't like them, no? No.
It's not.
You don't like having the Terminator thing on your...
I don't really pay attention to them. I don't really watch podcasts. I'm going to a convention at the end of the month, and some of the speakers are YouTubers. And everybody assumed that because I'm a prominent atheist, and these are prominent atheists on YouTube, that I was familiar with them. And, evidently a couple of them are awful on some issues. And they're like, how could you possibly do an event with them? And I was like, well, first of all, I was booked before anybody else. And once I'm booked, I'm booked. I mean, it's essentially a contract. But the other thing is, I had no idea who these people were. I'd never watched 10 seconds of any of their videos. And so I'm also not scared. So I can go there and listen to what they say and evaluate it for myself and report on it afterwards. There's a lot of assumptions, and atheists are just as prone to making them as anybody else. It's kind of frustrating.
That's interesting to hear, because obviously in my small corner of the movement, I'm dealing kind of more or less exclusively with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. And I found this kind of a marked contrast between those of us who are really keen on exploring dialogue and on trying to kind of reach through to people with empathy and listening to them and employing basically those steps that you gave in your video. And there are others who say, no, to hell with it. I'm going to gate crash into their places of worship. I'm going to stand outside with signs. I'm going to holler at them. I'm going to harass them in public. I'm going to throw down their literature carts on the street. It's interesting to think that maybe that's not unique to my side of the movement. Maybe there's that kind of attitude going on elsewhere as well.
Oh yeah, somebody, when we were at the Ark Encounter, Michael had on a shirt that said, "This is what an American atheist looked like," and an older gentleman there walked over and said, "Are you guys really atheists?" And she said, "Yes." And he just looked at her and said, "Every knee shall bow," and walked off. And that's kind of like the drive-by threat of, well, when you're dead, you'll figure, you'll find out. When it comes to tactics, though, I'm a fan of ridicule, of ideas, not people. I love humor, and I want godless music and godless humor and stuff, because I think you need all of these to fundamentally change the atmosphere around people so that atheism isn't this weird thing. Atheism is what a whole bunch of otherwise decent and funny and fun people, enjoy. I think you need those sorts of things. What I'm not a fan of is some of the things you kind of listed that are just antagonistic.
Yeah. Just basically kind of getting in people's faces and roughing them up a bit, and ridiculing them, that kind of thing.
I can see it in response. But I don't ever even when I meet street preachers, I don't just walk up to them and, start yelling or mocking them or anything else. I actually try to I try to stay higher than they are throughout the conversation, because they're not my audience. The people watching this conversation are my audience.
Right.
And I trust that the majority of people who are likely to be able to get it will get it without me going, hey, look, he's losing his temper here and he's getting riled up. And, it's
not going to win anyone over if you become emotional, basically, is it?
Well, I know that, I can't say what will or won't. People are going to change their mind for different reasons. There are, on the YouTube atheist kind of community, because there's multiple communities. There's not one atheist community. There are what I consider to be kind of the shock jocks of atheism, where it's all, mockery and fun, but it's almost mean, and it's, these people are stupid, and they'll, the creatards, and anything that ends in tard already just irritates the crap out of me, because my IQ didn't go up when I stopped believing. I wasn't a stupid person. I was misinformed, and I had mistakes in thinking just like everybody else. Now, I'm not going to go say, you shouldn't be doing this, because it doesn't change minds. It may, in fact, change minds. And the example I've used before, sorry to anybody who is a Santa Claus fan, but kids find their way out of the Santa Claus story in a number of different ways. Some of them engage in some skepticism and investigation, and they'll search through closets and find those. So they stay up late and they'll catch a parents, and they do an investigative process. Others just kind of gradually grow out of it. It just becomes intuitively obvious that this is silly. And yet there are still some who only find their way out, or primarily find their way out, because on the bus to school, they're being teased for still believing that little kid stuff. And while I certainly think that is mean, because you're directly mocking an individual, there's no denying that people will change their mind based on this, because nobody likes to be mocked. It's just that I'd rather give people a good foundation, because I think the religions are giving people a terrible foundation. And if you knock that out, then the beliefs go away. And if you prop up non-belief, if you prop up atheism, secularism, humanism on false foundations, you can stop believing in God because you're mad at him. I know people who've done that. This God fella thinks that, I'm wrong to, be gay or like whatever I like. And so screw that guy. I'm not going to believe him. Well, belief isn't a choice. And when you say that, you stop believing in God because you're mad at him, you didn't really stop believing in God. You just stopped acknowledging that you believed in God. And those are kind of different. I'd rather give good foundations. There's a video on my channel called Y'all Just Want to Sin. My wife actually did the voiceover intro at the beginning, because I love her accent. And it's perfect for y'all. But
it's a proper Texas accent, is it?
It's Tennessee.
Oh, Tennessee, right.
Yes, sorry. But it was prompted from a discussion we had, because previously when somebody would tell me, when Christians would say, oh, you don't believe because you just want to sin. And I would caution people and say, no, you tell them that's wrong, and then you give them the good reasons that you have. And I was wrong. It's perfectly reasonable to disbelieve because you want to sin. And what you have to understand about that is that there is the actual sin foundation is about saying this is wrong. You are fundamentally wrong in who you are. And you don't have to know anything about the ontological argument or the teleological arguments or tag or any of that, if you have a good reason to believe that someone is telling you something about you and what you're doing is wrong, and there's no good reason to think that's the case, that's sufficient reason to dismiss their assertion. And so that entire video kind of goes through that to say, you know what, in the proper framework, not believing in God because you want to sin is perfectly acceptable and reasonable.
Yeah, indeed, and I'm glad that you made that video, because it's certainly something that gets thrown my way a lot, and I see a lot on the channel. Oh, you're just making these videos because you want to sin. I'm just glad that you said what you said earlier about belief not being a choice, because one thing I've noticed in my very, very brief interactions with the quote-unquote atheist community is that there does seem to be this assumption that belief is a choice, and that people get wound up in cults because they've decided to, and well, these Jehovah's Witnesses, they were stupid to get involved in it in the first place, and making it all about intelligence and that kind of thing. Really, as someone who was literally baptized into this religion and raised from a very young age to believe it, like with that Santa Claus analogy, you do think, well, no, hang on, I didn't really have a choice in believing this,
Yeah, I mean, my friend JT has suggested that if people think beliefs are a choice, they should walk off the edge of a building and try to believe that gravity doesn't exist, which I find amusing, and it gets to the point. But actually, I'm going to be doing some events with Sam Harris, and we agree on a lot of things, but we disagree on some things too. So I'm looking forward to the chance to discuss those. But in his tiny book on free will and some other areas where he talks about the neuroscience behind decisions, he makes some really well-constructed cases that you don't perhaps choose anything, let alone what you are convinced of. For me, if you say I believe, then what you are saying is I am convinced that this is true or likely true. And being convinced isn't a decision, it's the result of becoming convinced. And you can become convinced for really bad reasons, which almost seem like you're just choosing it. And you can certainly make decisions about what information you pay attention to and how you weight it that ultimately lead to that. But your accepting a proposition is the result of becoming convinced. And what bugs me is when people say, oh, you can't reason people into things that they weren't reasoned into to begin with. Well, even if that were true, and I don't think it is, no, it's not relevant, because they were reasoned into it by bad reasoning. And if you point out what the bad reasoning was, and then you give them good reason for rejecting it, then you have in fact reasoned them out of it. So I don't think it's true to say they weren't reasoned into it. But I even if that were the case, even if I were to accept that, oh, somebody just made an emotional decision, we don't want to call that reasoning, rather than calling it bad reasoning, I still think you can reason them out of it by showing them the flaws in what led them there. What has ever changed someone's mind other than reasoning? Indeed.
Now, in my last few questions, I have a couple of questions from my Reddit followers. One of them is Wi-Fi Bandit, and his question is connected with his situation. I'll just tell you that much. What does Matt make of those of us who no longer believe, but due to the threat of shunning, etc., pretend? And he said, work against from the inside. And I think what he means is that in his particular situation, he's kind of almost forced to stay inside the religion, or he faces being shunned by his wife or his family, and so he's kind of doing what he can to assist with activism for those of us like myself who can speak more vocally by getting out documents and leaking out information from the inside and that kind of thing. I think he basically wants to know if you have any advice for people in his situation.
Nah, good for him. I repeatedly pointed out, I want as many out atheists as we can get. Unfortunately, it's not safe for everybody. If I want you to come out if you think you can, because that fundamentally changes how people perceive this. Oh, hey, there's way more atheists than we thought. But if you can't, if you think that your life's going to be worse off, if your job, your health, your mental health, your family stuff, if all that's in jeopardy for coming out, then don't come out. I have no problem at all with somebody lying in a situation like that because it saves them from mountains of trouble. We know people who've lost their jobs, lost their families, been run out of towns. And, the Clergy Project, by the way, I think there's like over 700 members now, and they're current and former clergy people who are on an anonymous forum. None of them believe anymore. And yet, in many cases, not only can they not come out, but, if you've been a preacher for 20 years and all of a sudden you find you don't believe, what the hell do you do?
Yeah.
You may not have any skill set. Like I was going to be a preacher, Southern Baptist, there's no requirement that I go to college or seminary or theology schools or any of that. The only thing that's required is that the church like me enough to hire me as the preacher. That's it. Preacher appointed by God, not by colleges. And if I've done that for 20 years and I have no other skills, what am I going to do? And now, when we talk about working from within, I know members of the Clergy Project who have fundamentally changed the nature of their sermons to where even if they go to something like the Bible, what they're teaching is far closer to secular humanism than Christianity. This whole thing that we mentioned earlier in the show about interpretations, they're finding ways to interpret things in order to try to encourage good in their congregation. If the church is corrupt, and you have access to that information and can release it, I don't know that I have any objection to that either. But the important thing is that for everybody else who can come out, to do so, because that changes the world around you in much the same way that you change the world around Intractable Minds. You change the world around the people who can't come out so that hopefully they can. If we get a larger group of people out saying, I'm a secularist, I'm an atheist, I'm a free thinker, whatever, then all of a sudden that individual who's writing that question who can't come out might be able to.
Indeed. I think he'll find, I kind of know him a bit, so I think he'll find that encouraging. Carol Jean from Twitter asks, what books do you think would be helpful for JWs who are starting to critically think and wake up?
The Bible.
Yeah.
I have a lot of books. I'm not as familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses stuff. I think the books that I tend to recommend first have nothing to do with religion. John Allen Paulus has a book called Innumeracy that talks about how bad we are at math and estimations and statistics. I think that's useful in showing how statistics are used to manipulate how we think about things. Statistics are wonderful when done right and awful when done wrong, which seems to be most of the time, like 93%. I just made that statistic up. 93% of the time statistics are being misused. That's one of them. There are a couple of college textbooks on logic that I like. There's one by Hurley called A Concise Introduction to Logic. And there's one by Walton called Informal Logic. It's a handbook for critical argumentation. Those types of things give you a fairly simple introduction into fallacies and what's important about them and how to go about making sure that you're arguing honestly and accurately. When it comes to religion itself, atheists have had to do virtually no work. If you want to know what's wrong with the First Baptist Church, you can go to the Second Baptist Church and they will tell you. And if you want to know what's wrong with, Protestant doctrines, you can go to the Catholic Church and they will tell you. And if you want to know what's wrong with Catholicism, you can ask a Jew. And if you want to know what's wrong with Judaism, you can ask a Muslim, and so on and so on and so on. All atheists are doing is agreeing with all of them that the others are awful. And so if you're a JW right now and you're starting to question, if you like books, there are books out there. I don't know that I have specific recommendations. I like Guy P. Harrison's book, 50 Reasons People Give for Believing in a God. I think it's approachable by anybody. I think if you learn more from, Bill videos and podcasts, stuff like this, or the work on the Atheist Debates or the Atheist Experience Show. Seth Andrews has amazing videos that enlighten people to all sorts of problems, and they're done in a slick style, and he has a voice like butter.
He does, doesn't he?
So, he's a perfect radio.
I'm going to be interviewing him on one of the next videos, by the way, so yeah.
Well, he's absolutely one of my best friends on the planet and has been for many years. And I love his content, and we are very different in how we do things. Like he puts together a presentation, and I just talk off the cuff, and it's just because we have different styles. And I think it's one of the reasons why we work so well together, that we can, and between the two of us, we can reach quite a few people. So I apologize. I don't know enough about JWs to recommend like anti-JW books and stuff, but I don't think you need an anti-JW book. I think you need a pro-reason book. If you just stop taking whatever you're being given at face value, go look at what other religions have had to say about Jehovah's Witnesses. And it reminds me of the quote from Ben Franklin, where a book of arguments against deism came into his possession, and upon reading it, he realized the arguments were so bad that he instantly became a deist.
That backfired.
Yeah, it's. I think that the mere fact that you're willing to question means off to a good start. It can certainly, and not just with regard to religion, it can certainly be frustrating to try and figure out what sources do I listen to. Which news source do I listen to? And Facebook's just feeding me all the stuff that's, exactly what I already believe and all this. Fine, then get away from all of that. As much as people complain about Wikipedia, it is a good starting spot. Pick articles that have multiple references at the bottom and then go and read those references and see if they have other things. You don't ever have to buy a single book. I would also recommend infidels.org. There are tons of articles up there specifically about various versions of Christianity in the Bible. I don't know if there's anything specifically JW, but like I was saying, I'm not going to advocate, let's find out what's wrong with Jehovah's Witness. The question should be, why should I remain a Jehovah's Witness? Do I have good reason to think this is true, rather than looking for reasons to think it's false? Because that is a shifting of the burden of proof, and you will probably stay mired in it forever if you're looking for someone to prove it false, especially because you don't know where to begin, or there's an excuse or an answer or an apologetic for almost any objection.
Indeed. Well, actually, my final question was going to be, do you have a message for someone who is, looking to kind of struggle their way out of religion? I think that's a great way of ending, in fact, to just not be ashamed to think for yourself.
Yeah, I love. So I get this question a bunch from different people. It shows up in email. I'm struggling with my belief, and what should I do? Keep doing what you're doing. The mere fact that you're struggling with your belief probably means that you don't believe, and you're just looking to feel better about it. You're looking to make sure that you're not making the same mistake twice, that you don't jumping out of the frying pan and going into the fire, which, depending on your view of hell, could be literal. Just be honest with yourself and honest with other people. Care about whether the ideas are true rather than whether they're comfortable or popular. Figure out how you would go about demonstrating the truth of what it is that you're being presented with. John Loftus has what he calls the outsider test for faith, which is, let me pretend for a second that I don't believe my current religious views. What reason would I have to believe it? What reason would an outsider, somebody who's never been presented with these ideas, have to accept it? Why is it so important that we get kids right away and indoctrinate them with the happiest, friendliest, infectious songs and versions of Bible stories, rather than talking about the slaughter, the slavery, the genocide, the subjugation of women, the prohibitions against all sorts of stuff? Meanwhile, God is talking to the men and letting them have lots of wives, and there are difficult problems in any holy book. The thing is, if you begin with, oh, it's true, Well, it's easy to rationalize any of that because you can always just say, God didn't make it so we could understand it. He'll explain it once we're to heaven, or it's not our job to understand it. We are here to obey and trust that, goodness will come out. That's not skepticism. It's not critical thinking. It is not taking responsibility for one's life. If you actually care about whether or not something's true, rather than whether or not it brings you peace or comfort or hope, you'll get with work to a worldview that is primarily founded on truth. Because the important thing is, I don't have to believe Jehovah's Witness claims are false. I just have to not be convinced that they're true. Indeed. And I can reserve judgment. Every position I have is tentative and subject to revision as soon as there's evidence to the contrary. It's just about not leaping to conclusions and not being indoctrinated into conclusions without good reasons.
Indeed. Well said. I definitely applaud you on that. And Matt, thank you so much for joining me for this interview. It's been a big honor. I hope that it's not the last time that I'm able to chat with you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this interview, guys. Please don't forget to subscribe to see more interviews like this. And as always, thank you for watching.